Guys, Skylar with Cedar Ridge Management. I'm excited to talk to you about how to determine rent price for the highest annual return. Let's just dive in. Now, one of Warren Buffett's favorite sayings is seek to be greedy when others are fearful, and fearful when others are greedy. So I want to briefly talk about COVID and how this relates to pricing. Now, as I'm recording this, it's January of 2026, and that's important. We saw during COVID prices just rise and rise and rise and rise and rise, right? Um, we're out of COVID now, and people are still trying to get COVID prices. They're still trying to push the market. And this is an example of the second half of this quote here, which is be fearful when others are greedy. So right now, you see a lot of investors and a lot of landlords, they're being greedy. And when they're being greedy, trying to get that high price, Warren Buffett says you want to be prudent and act like you're fearful, act like you can't find a tenant, act like you can't, you're not going to get that. So price lower. That's how to apply this quote from Warren Buffett about pricing a rental property. And we're going to dive into some specifics. So let's just keep going. So we're going to talk today about effective gross income, about vacancy loss, about how to minimize vacancy to max out your income. We're going to talk about what's listed for rent versus what signed leases are getting for rent. And then we'll talk about Zillow and this thing called the multiple list service, which is a service available just to realtors to help find prices and talk about what's for rent, what's for sale, etc. So effective gross income. This is gross potential income minus vacancy loss equals effective gross income. Now, the gross potential income is the maximum rent a property could get if it was 100% occupied. And interestingly enough, gross potential rent is really more set by the supply and demand curve of the economy and the local place. And there's some things you can do to offset that a little bit, but largely it's the supply and demand curve that says what a property is going to rent for. And just if you sit back really quickly and you think about the supply and demand curve, how you're going to have less, you're going to charge less for rent in a very rural area where there's less people than you are in the city. And that's just a very simple example of the supply and demand curve kind of dictating that rent price, and not necessarily just the property. Now, that's a principle, right? So properties matter, and I don't want to get wrapped around that right now. Principally, I want you to remember that it's the supply and demand curve that affects that gross potential income a ton. So if supply is really high and demand is really low, then rents are going to be lower. If supply is very low and demand is very high, then rents are going to be higher. And our job as your property managers is to know that price. And we want to list the property for rent at that price. Now, a fear you might have, and a fear we even have sometimes, right, is that we're losing out on money. We don't want to price so low that we miss out on income that we could have had. That might resonate with you. The most common mistake, however, is pricing too high, setting that price too high at the beginning and having to drop a lot. And what that's going to do, as you'll see, is max that vacancy out and minimize the total revenue you could earn in a given year. So effective gross income in this example on the screen here is the gross potential income of this property of $27,900 and a vacancy loss of $1,395. And that gives us an effective gross income of $26,505. All right, we break these things down so we can talk about them individually. And now we're going to talk about vacancy loss. So this vacancy loss can be controlled. And the two things to control vacancy loss the most are, one, price the property correctly from day one. And what we mean by that is knowing that supply demand curve, also matching the price to the type of property. So if we have a Class A property, we should get more for that Class A property than if we have a Class C property. And we don't want a Class A price on a Class C property, and we don't want a Class C price on a Class A property, right? So there's a lot that goes into there, but we really want to get that price right from day one to minimize vacancy. And the next thing is we want the property to be clean and neat in appearance, and just think hotel clean, right? A Class C property really clean is good. A Class A property really clean is good. Either of them dirty is bad, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a Class A property or a B property or C property. It just has to be clean and neat in appearance. All right. Next, we want to minimize vacancy so we can max out our income. So to determine our rent price, to do that, we're going to look at Zillow, and that's going to give us a really good idea of the supply that's on the market. How many 3-bedroom, 2-baths are for rent? How many 4-bedroom houses are for rent? Whatever the house is, right? We're going to look to see how many of that type of property are listed for rent. And then we're going to also look at some things that might not be exactly like it. So in this market, when inflation over the last years has been high and people are feeling the financial crunch, if you would live in a townhome, you would probably also live in an apartment. So we're going to look at the supply if we're looking at townhomes, and we're going to compare the townhome supply with the apartment supply, because the same renter might rent both of those things. All right, so next, we're going to look at supply, and then after that, we're going to look at the multiple list service, which is something that's available to real estate agents and realtors. And it gives us the advantage to see what things actually rented for, because the price you see on Zillow isn't what signed leases get all the time. Sometimes it is, but that's what Zillow is, what people want. It's not what they actually get. And on the MLS, as we'll see in an example in a little bit later, we can actually see that 123 Main Street rented for, and we have a signed lease for $1,000, $2,000, whatever. But that data is there for real estate agents and realtors to look at. And we use that to determine the rent price. So we look at supply, we look at demand, and then we determine the rent price. So again, just to minimize vacancy, to max out your income, when supply is high and demand is low, we want to price lower to minimize vacancy. When supply is low and demand is high, we might actually price higher than you see on Zillow, because the supply demand curve is shifted, and we'll probably be able to do that. Again, this is why you hired a professional, because we're thinking about all of these things to make you as much money as possible as your property managers. So I reviewed hundreds and hundreds of closed rentals last year, and I compared the days on market with the original list price and the final lease price. And I found that if there was a price drop, the average days on market was actually 63 days. And then when it was actually leased at 63 days, the leased price ended up being what the prices that were, or the houses that were listed and leased in 24 days, it was the same price. So what this is telling us is that if you start high and drop, you're going to extend your vacancy, and you're going to end up with the same rent price anyway. So if you look at this, right, the average vacancy loss with a price drop was $3,759. And if we do some math and we look at the vacancy loss with no price drop of $1,432, we see that you would have gotten more money if you priced the property right from the beginning. And you would have gotten, in this scenario, $2,327 more when you priced it right, versus starting high and going low. And breaking that down even more, this is an example. I don't know if that address is fictional or real, probably a real address, but that doesn't really matter. Based on the number of rentals available and the days on market in the MLS, the price of this rental should be $1,895. And at that $1,895 number, the days on market would be 24. If you go to Zillow and look at this, you'll see a lot of 3-bedroom, 2-house properties, 3-bedroom, 2-bath properties priced at $2,100. Now, from my research from last year, I know that the average days on market for that property is going to be 63, and it's going to end up renting for less than 2,100 anyway. So we're not going to be able to get that 2,100 number, and we're going to end up renting at $1,895. So your gross potential rents minus your vacancy loss equals effective gross income is actually going to look like is this. If we priced too high to start, we're going to end up with 63 days of vacancy and a monthly rent of $1,895, which is going to give us an effective gross income of $18,760. And the difference there is $2,486. So in this example, we would have made $2,486 more if we started at $1,895 than if we worked our way to $1,895. All right, now, what's for rent versus signed leases? So we're just going to look at this. This should look very familiar. All right, this is Zillow. So we're looking at a bunch of houses. You can see this one at 105 Riedel Lane, 3-bed, 2.5 bath, listed for $2,295. And it's been on the market for 36 days. And they're staying strong, I think. Now, I'm going to go to the multiple list service, right? So Zillow, again, is what's for rent. The MLS is what's rented. And I see this 3-bedroom, 2-bath house that has a signed lease at $2,000. And it was only on the market for 14 days. So this person's going to make more money than this person because they're priced right and they're not going to have a lot of vacancy. So remember, guys, our goal is to minimize vacancy at the right price to maximize your effective gross income. If Cedar Ridge recommends a price to you, by the way, just so you know how confident I am and how confident we are in this, if we recommend a price and you approve all of the rent-ready work that we suggest, we guarantee leasing your property in 30 days, or we'll waive a month of management fees. We really, really love this stuff, and I hope you do too. Thank you for trusting us. I'm excited to find a tenant for you and make you the most money possible. Hope this was helpful, and look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.